All right, let's dive into a really fascinating time in American history.
Yeah.
Early 1900s,
Uh-huh.
when America really started to flex its muscles on the world stage.
It did.
It's like they were done with staying isolated and decided, hey, we're a power player now.
It was a real turning point.
And we're going to explore how that played out, especially with Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy interventions in Latin America
Yeah.
and the Panama Canal.
A lot going on.
Buckle up because we're about to uncover some pretty juicy details.
It's going to be interesting for sure.
So, to kick things off, let's talk about this whole big stick idea.
Okay.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
That's the one.
Our sources really paint a picture of Roosevelt's worldview.
They do.
And honestly, it might sound a little, well, jarring to modern ears.
You could say that.
So, help us understand this.
Okay.
How did Roosevelt see America's place in the world?
Well, basically, he believed in a hierarchy of nations.
A hierarchy, like some countries were better than others.
Yeah, pretty much.
And of course, America was at the top.
Right at the top.
Okay, so who else was up there in this hierarchy?
In Roosevelt's view, well, the so-called civilized nations.
And what made a nation civilized?
Usually it came down to being white,
Okay.
Anglo-Saxon, and economically developed.
So basically, countries that looked and acted like America.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And those civilized nations had a responsibility to...
Guy, the uncivilized ones.
Guys!
That's how we put it. But often it meant intervene.
Intervene, even if those other nations didn't want them to.
That seems to have been the thinking.
Wow, that's a pretty bold way of looking at things.
It certainly had a huge impact on American foreign policy.
So if a nation wasn't white or industrialized enough...
In Roosevelt's eyes, they needed America to step in and, fix things.
I see. And I guess that explains a lot about American involvement in places like Latin America.
It does.
But hold on, our sources mention Japan as an exception.
Yes, that's a really interesting case.
They were rapidly industrializing.
Right.
But they weren't exactly a white Anglo-Saxon nation.
No, they weren't.
So how did Roosevelt view Japan?
Well, he recognized their growing power.
He did.
And he actually saw them as a force to be reckoned with.
Really?
Even a potential threat.
So it wasn't just about race, but also about power dynamics.
I think that's right.
Japan being a major player really changes things.
It adds a whole new layer of complexity to the situation.
Absolutely. And speaking of Asia, our sources dive into Roosevelt's involvement in the Russo-Japanese War.
Oh, yeah.
Which is pretty wild considering he won a Nobel Peace Prize for it.
A bit ironic, isn't it?
Totally. So what was Roosevelt's goal in that whole situation?
He was determined to prevent any single country from dominating Asia.
He wanted to maintain a balance of power.
Exactly.
And his mediation in the war actually helped end the conflict.
It did.
But it also marked a turning point in U.S.-Japanese relations.
Yeah, tensions started to rise.
Foreshadowing conflicts that would unfortunately come later.
It's a complicated story.
Definitely. And then there's the Great White Fleet.
Oh, that's a great story.
Sending that massive naval fleet on a world tour.
Imagine that.
With a very prominent stop in Japan.
Yeah.
It was definitely a show of force.
No doubt about it.
So what was the message there?
It was a way of saying, hey, world, the U.S. is a force to be reckoned with.
And Japan, we're looking at you.
Exactly.
So we've got America flexing its muscles in Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's shift our focus to Latin America.
Okay.
Our sources suggest this period was just the beginning of a long pattern of U.S. involvement in the region.
It was.
And honestly, it doesn't paint a very pretty picture.
No, it doesn't.
It's almost like they saw Latin America as their own personal playground.
Yeah, there was definitely a sense of that.
So how did that whole situation start?
Well, remember that belief in a hierarchy of nations?
Yeah, America at the top and everyone else below.
Right. That really came into play in U.S.-Latin American relations.
How so?
Well, it all started with this seemingly minor event.
What happened?
European powers were trying to collect debts from Venezuela.
Okay.
And Roosevelt was not having it.
He wasn't going to let Europe push Venezuela around.
Nope. He saw it as a threat to American interests.
So what did he do?
He issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
The Roosevelt Corollary?
Yeah, which basically declared that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American affairs.
Wait, so instead of Europe calling the shots,
The U.S. was taking over?
they were just replacing one form of outside control with another.
That's one way to look at it.
And this Roosevelt Corollary basically turned the Monroe Doctrine
Which was initially about keeping Europe out of the Americas.
into a justification for U.S. dominance.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate assessment.
Wow. So how did this play out in practice?
Not great.
I mean, did the U.S. just barge into any Latin American country whenever they felt like it?
Pretty much.
And what about the countries themselves? Did they just accept this?
I mean, they didn't really have a choice.
It's one thing to say you have the right to intervene, but it's another to actually do it.
Right, and it had lasting consequences.
How so?
It shaped U.S.-Latin American relations for decades.
And not in a good way.
It led to a lot of resentment, that's for sure.
Makes sense. It's like being told, we're here to help, when what you really want is to be left alone.
Exactly.
And our sources give us some specific examples of this intervention,
They do.
like the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, the U.S. took control of their finances to ensure debts to European nations were repaid.
It's like they were saying, we'll handle this, you stay out of it.
Which is pretty patronizing when you think about it.
Totally. And then there's Cuba.
Cuba.
After gaining independence from Spain,
Right.
they were forced to include the Platt Amendment in their constitution,
Yeah, that was a big deal.
essentially giving the U.S. the right to step in whenever they saw a threat to their interests.
And they did intervene. Multiple times.
To squash rebellions.
Too often, yes.
It's like they were giving Cuba freedom with one hand and taking it away with the other.
It's a really complex situation.
And our sources also mention Nicaragua.
Yeah.
The U.S. supported insurgents there
They did.
and used their financial clout to influence the government.
Right.
It seems like they were pulling strings everywhere they went,
They were definitely trying to exert their influence.
all under the guise of maintaining stability, right?
That was the justification. But it often served to advance American economic and strategic interests.
It makes you wonder about the true nature of American involvement in the region.
It does raise some important questions.
So we've got this pattern of intervention in Latin America, and now how about we dive into the Panama Canal?
Right.
It was a massive accomplishment for Roosevelt,
It was.
and it completely transformed global trade.
It did.
But the story behind its construction is anything but simple.
Oh no, it's full of twists and turns.
Our sources describe backroom deals, political maneuvering, and even a U.S.-backed revolt in Panama.
It's a pretty wild story.
Roosevelt was determined to build that canal.
He was.
And it seems like he wasn't afraid to play hardball to get it done.
He definitely played a very active role.
So the Panama Canal stands as this huge symbol of American ambition.
It does.
But it also raises some ethical questions.
It does.
Did the ends justify the means?
That's a question for the ages.
It's a reminder that progress often comes at a cost.
It does.
And it's important to think about who pays that cost.
Totally.
But let's move beyond Roosevelt for a moment.
Okay.
What about his successors, Taft and Wilson?
Right.
How did they approach foreign policy?
Well, Taft took a more economically driven approach.
What do you mean?
He focused on using American investments as leverage.
Less big stick and more big wallet.
Exactly.
So it was all about economic power.
To a large extent, yes.
But even though he downplayed the military aspect,
Right.
his policies still led to interventions.
Especially in the Caribbean.
So not that different from Roosevelt in the end.
Well, the methods were different, but the outcome was often the same.
And then there's Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
He campaigned on this whole idea of moral diplomacy, right?
He did.
Like America should be the shining beacon of morality in the world.
That was the idea.
But how did that play out in practice?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Did he actually live up to his promises?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, you're going to leave us hanging.
For now, yes.
All right, fine, but I'm already hooked.
I thought you might be.
We'll be back soon to uncover the rest of this story.
You won't want to miss it.
So we left off with Wilson and his moral diplomacy, trying to navigate this chaotic situation in Mexico.
It was a real mess down there.
Did he manage to stay true to his ideals?
Well, that's debatable.
Or did he get pulled into the turmoil south of the border?
It's a complicated story.
It always is with foreign policy.
That's for sure.
So help us unravel this. What happened with Wilson in Mexico?
Well, his approach really highlights those contradictions.
Contradiction?
Yeah, those inherent in American foreign policy at the time.
Okay, give us an example.
He refused to recognize the Huerta regime.
Huerta?
Yeah, he saw it as illegitimate.
Okay.
Yet he used the Tampico incident.
Hold on. The Tampico incident, what was that?
It sounds like something straight out of a history book, right?
It does, and I'm going to be honest, I need a refresher.
No problem, basically.
Okay.
It started with a minor misunderstanding.
What happened?
A group of American sailors were arrested.
Where? A Mexican port city.
Right.
Okay, so they were arrested. What happened next?
It was brief. The Mexican government apologized,
They did.
but Wilson saw an opportunity
An opportunity for what?
to assert American authority.
Even though the Mexican government apologized.
Yeah, he demanded a 21-gun salute
A 21-gun salute.
as the formal apology.
Wow, that seems a little...
Extreme.
Yeah, I mean, it was a misunderstanding.
And the Mexicans refused.
They did.
Yeah, they weren't going to be bullied.
So what did Wilson do?
Well, this seemingly small incident,
Okay.
it escalated quickly.
Really?
And it gave Wilson the justification he needed
Oh, boy.
to send U.S. forces to Veracruz
He sent troops.
to occupy the port.
So a simple misunderstanding turned into a military occupation.
That's pretty much what happened.
It sounds like he was looking for an excuse to intervene.
It does make you wonder.
And it definitely raises questions about his commitment to non-intervention.
It does.
But it gets even more complicated.
Oh, yeah.
With Pancho Villa.
The legendary revolutionary.
Didn't he lead a raid on American soil?
He did.
Tell us about that.
Well, after that Veracruz incident,
Okay.
Wilson initially considered supporting Villa,
Really?
but he ended up backing Carranza,
Who was that?
another revolutionary leader.
Okay, so he chose sides.
You could say that.
And how did Villa react to that?
Well, he felt betrayed,
Understandably.
and he retaliated.
How?
He led a raid on Columbus, New Mexico.
On American soil?
Yep.
Wow. And what happened?
Several Americans were killed,
Oh, wow.
which obviously sparked outrage in the U.S.
I can imagine.
And what did Wilson do?
I bet I can guess.
He sent General Pershing
Oh, boy. Here we go again.
and a large force
Into Mexico.
to pursue Villa.
So Wilson sent troops into Mexico to hunt down Pancho Villa.
That's right.
That's a pretty bold move.
It was a major escalation.
Even for a president who was supposedly committed to morality in foreign policy.
It does seem to contradict his earlier ideals, doesn't it?
Big time. And what happened with the Pershing expedition?
Well, it was a major undertaking,
Okay.
and it almost brought the U.S. and Mexico to war.
Wow, seriously.
It's a clear example of how realpolitik often trumps idealism,
I guess so. When it comes to international affairs,
especially back then.
it's a good reminder that foreign policy is rarely black and white.
It's messy.
Yeah, there are always competing interests,
Absolutely.
unexpected events, and tough choices.
All the time.
But speaking of tough choices,
Yeah.
let's circle back to the Roosevelt corollary.
Right?
Our sources argue that this seemingly straightforward policy
Right.
had some pretty long-lasting consequences
It did.
for U.S.-Latin American relations.
It really shaped things.
So, remind us again, what did the corollary allow the U.S. to do?
Basically, it allowed them to act as a police force
A police force.
in Latin America
Intervening in their affairs whenever they felt it was necessary.
to protect American interests or maintain stability.
It seems like that paved the way for the U.S. to become the dominant power in the region,
It did.
often at the expense of Latin American sovereignty.
And self-determination.
What were the long-term implications?
Well, it created a pattern
A pattern of what?
of intervention and resentment,
That lasted for decades.
even to this day,
By propping up dictators,
in intervening in democratic processes.
the U.S. actually created instability
In many ways, yes.
and anti-American sentiment.
Absolutely.
So the Roosevelt corollary backfired.
You could say that.
It undermined the very goals it was supposed to achieve.
That's the irony.
It's like a vicious cycle. The U.S. intervened to protect its interests, which created instability
Right.
and resentment, leading to further intervention.
It's a tough pattern to break.
It's a cautionary tale about unintended consequences.
For sure.
But looking back at this whole period, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson,
Yeah.
it seems like they all shared a belief in American exceptionalism.
They did.
This idea that America was unique,
Especially.
destined for greatness.
And with a responsibility to guide the world.
It's almost like they felt a burden
You could say that.
to shape the world according to their values.
And their interests.
But it also raises questions about wielding that kind of power,
It does.
especially when it comes to interfering in other nations' affairs.
It's a complex issue.
No doubt. So we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
from big stick diplomacy to dollar diplomacy,
And moral diplomacy.
from Asia to Latin America.
It's been a whirlwind tour.
What would you say are the key takeaways from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this period
Yeah.
marked a fundamental shift in American foreign policy.
Okay.
A move away from isolationism,
Towards what?
global engagement.
America was stepping onto the world stage,
And they were determined to make their presence felt.
and that had some pretty major consequences.
Both good and bad.
It shaped America's relationships with other nations.
For sure.
It shaped their role in international affairs.
And their self-perception as a global leader.
But it also left behind these unanswered questions.
And ongoing debates.
About the nature of power.
The limits of intervention.
And the ethical dilemmas of projecting power on the world stage.
Those are questions we still wrestle with today.
And that's what makes studying history so important.
It's not just about the past.
It's about understanding the present.
And shaping the future.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, it's clear that this era was pivotal for America's place in the world.
It was a turning point.
But it also left behind a legacy of unanswered questions.
And we'll explore those further in the final part of our deep dive.
You won't want to miss it. All right, so we've journeyed through this really turbulent time for America.
Yeah, it was a pivotal era.
A time when they really stepped onto that world stage,
Definitely.
wielding their power in ways that people still debate today.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up our deep dive,
Okay.
let's try to distill all this down.
Right.
What does it all mean, especially for, our listeners today?
Well, I think this era really highlights America's transformation.
Okay.
From this isolated nation to a true global powerhouse.
And that shift was driven by,
a lot of factors, really.
like what?
Economic interests, for sure, strategic considerations, and this deep-seated belief in American exceptionalism.
That they were special, destined for greatness.
Exactly.
And we've seen how that played out with Roosevelt's big stick,
Right.
Taft's dollar diplomacy,
And
even Wilson's attempts at a more moral approach.
But despite their differences, they all ended up intervening in other countries' affairs.
It seems almost inevitable.
In a way, yes.
And it's crucial to understand the impact of those interventions.
Especially in Latin America.
Right, that's where it gets really complicated.
The Roosevelt corollary basically gave the U.S. free rein down there.
To meddle, interfere.
Exactly. Propping up dictators, undermining democratic movements.
And that legacy, that's still felt today, isn't it?
Without a doubt, it continues to shape U.S.-Latin American relations.
It's like those decisions from over a century ago still echo in how these countries interact and view each other.
It's a long shadow.
And then there's the Panama Canal, this incredible feat of engineering.
A testament to American ambition.
But it also came at a cost. Right.
It did.
Ethical questions about how the U.S. achieved its goals.
It's a perfect example of that complex legacy.
The Panama Canal itself transformed global trade. It's still vital to the world's economy. But those backroom deals, the U.S.-backed revolt,
and the disregard for Panamanian sovereignty.
It casts a shadow over the whole thing.
That's a mixed bag for sure.
It's a reminder that progress often involves tough choices.
And it's important to consider everyone's perspective.
Not just the winners, right?
Exactly.
So what can we learn from all of this? How does this history help us today?
I think it gives us valuable insights into the nature of power, the challenges of wielding it responsibly.
Makes you think twice about those motivations behind foreign policy decisions.
For sure.
Questioning those narratives, thinking about the long-term consequences.
It's crucial to understand the ripple effects.
And it forces us to grapple with this whole idea of American exceptionalism. Was it a valid concept or just a way to justify dominance?
And how does it shape America's actions even now?
These are tough questions.
They are.
But that's what makes history so fascinating.
It's not about simple answers.
It's about wrestling with these complex issues, expanding our understanding. So as we leave you with this final thought, keep questioning, keep exploring those connections between the past and present.
It's an ongoing journey.
Because understanding history isn't just about looking back.
It's about equipping ourselves for the future.
Making more informed decisions.
Building a better world for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for our deep dive into this pivotal moment in American history.
Thanks for joining us.